The most famous comedy duo in entertainment history had been separated by death for exactly 48 hours, when Jerry Lewis decided that 20 years of silence, bitterness, and mutual avoidance meant nothing compared to 49 years of shared memories. On December 27, 1995, at Pierce Brothers' Westwood Village Memorial Park, Jerry Lewis arrived uninvited at Dean Martin's funeral, with tears streaming down his face, and a determination that no amount of family opposition or security interference could diminish. The man who had been explicitly excluded from the funeral arrangements by Dean's children was about to prove that some bonds transcend family wishes, legal restrictions, and social conventions. What happened when Jerry Lewis crashed Dean Martin's funeral would expose the depth of grief that had been hidden beneath decades of professional animosity and personal pride, revealing that the partnership they had destroyed in anger was still the most important relationship either man had ever known. The confrontation that would transform a private family funeral into a public display of unresolved love began with a phone call that was never made and ended with an embrace that was 20 years overdue. It started as an attempt to maintain dignity in death and concluded as a reminder that some relationships are too deep to be killed by pride, too authentic to be destroyed by business disputes, and too fundamental to human identity to be erased by time or intentional neglect. Jerry Lewis had learned of Dean Martin's death the way the rest of America had, through television news reports that interrupted regular programming on Christmas Day 1995. Jerry was at his Las Vegas home, spending a quiet holiday with his family, when the bulletin flashed across the screen. Dean Martin, legendary entertainer and member of the Rat Pack, has died at his Beverly Hills home at the age of 78. The words hit Jerry like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected. Dean had been in declining health for years, but because they made permanent a separation that Jerry had always believed could somehow be repaired. For 20 years, Jerry had been telling himself that he and Dean would eventually reconcile, that the anger and hurt that had driven them apart after their partnership ended in 1956 would eventually fade, and that they would find a way back to the friendship that had once defined both their lives. Even during the years when they refused to speak to each other, when they avoided industry events where they might encounter each other, when they gave interviews that contained barely concealed criticisms of each other's character and professional choices, Jerry had maintained the secret belief that their estrangement was temporary. Dean's death eliminated that possibility forever. There would be no reconciliation, no opportunity to apologize for things said in anger, no chance to rebuild the relationship that had made them both famous and ultimately destroyed their friendship. Jerry Lewis was facing the reality that one of the most important people in his life had died while they were still enemies, and that he would have to live with that fact for the rest of his own life. The funeral arrangements, handled by Dean's children from his various marriages, had been deliberately designed to exclude Jerry Lewis. The family had made no secret of their belief that Jerry's presence would be inappropriate and disruptive to the solemn occasion they were trying to orchestrate. Dean's son, Ricky Martin, had been particularly vocal about his opposition to Jerry's attendance, telling reporters that Jerry had lost the right to grieve publicly when he chose to end his partnership with Dean in such an acrimonious fashion. But Jerry's determination to attend Dean's funeral had nothing to do with public relations or media attention, and everything to do with the guilt and regret that had been consuming him since their partnership ended. For nearly 40 years, Jerry had been haunted by the way things had ended between them. Not with a conversation, or even a final argument, but with lawyers and agents and business managers handling the dissolution of their professional relationship, while the personal relationship simply withered from neglect and mutual stubbornness. Jerry had replayed their final performance together thousands of times in his mind, July 24, 1956, at the Copacabana in New York. They had done their act with the same precision and chemistry that had made them the biggest draw in show business, but backstage, they had barely spoken to each other. They had shaken hands perfunctorily, said goodbye in the most formal terms possible, and walked away from each other without either man realizing that they would never have a real conversation again. The tragedy of their estrangement wasn't that they had fought, it was that they had simply stopped trying to understand each other. Dean had wanted more creative control and fewer performance dates. Jerry had wanted to maintain their rigorous schedule and expand into new areas of entertainment. Both men had valid points, but neither had been willing to compromise, and their inability to communicate had destroyed the most successful comedy partnership in American history. On the morning of December 27, 1995, Jerry Lewis made the decision that would define the final chapter of his relationship with Dean Martin. He was going to Dean's funeral, regardless of whether he was invited, regardless of what Dean's family wanted, and regardless of the potential for public embarrassment or legal consequences. He was going to say goodbye to the man who had been his partner, his brother, and his best friend before they had become strangers. Jerry dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a black suit and tie that conveyed both respect for the solemn nature of the event and his determination to be present for Dean's final farewell. He drove from Las Vegas to Los Angeles in silence, using the time to prepare himself for what he knew would be an emotionally devastating experience. He wasn't just going to Dean's funeral. He was going to confront 40 years of regret, missed opportunities, and the knowledge that he had allowed pride to destroy the most important relationship of his professional life. Pierce Brothers' Westwood Village Memorial Park was already crowded with mourners when Jerry arrived at 10:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the scheduled service was set to begin. The funeral had attracted a mix of entertainment industry luminaries, Dean's family members, and longtime friends who wanted to pay their respects to one of the last surviving members of the Rat Pack era. Frank Sinatra, despite his own declining health, was scheduled to attend, along with numerous actors, singers, producers, and directors who had worked with Dean during his decades-long career. Jerry parked his car and walked toward the chapel where the service was to be held, his heart pounding with a combination of grief, nervousness, and determination. He knew that his presence would be unwelcome, that Dean's family would view his attendance as an intrusion, and that his appearance might create the kind of media spectacle that would overshadow the dignity of Dean's funeral. But he also knew that this was his last chance to honor the man who had been the most important professional collaborator of his life. As Jerry approached the chapel entrance, he was intercepted by two security guards who had clearly been briefed about the possibility of his appearance. The guards were polite but firm, explaining that the service was private and that Jerry's name was not on the approved guest list. Jerry's response was immediate and emotional. "I don't care about guest lists. Dean Martin was my partner for 10 years. I have a right to be here." The security guards found themselves in an impossible situation. They had been hired to maintain order and prevent disruptions, but they were dealing with someone whose grief was genuine and whose connection to the deceased was undeniable. Jerry Lewis wasn't a celebrity seeking publicity or a fan trying to insert himself into a private moment. He was a man who had shared the most successful years of Dean Martin's career and who was demanding the right to say goodbye. "Sir," one of the guards said gently, "we understand your feelings, but we have specific instructions from the family. This is a private service." Jerry's voice broke as he responded, "The family doesn't get to decide who loved Dean Martin. They don't get to determine who has the right to grieve. I knew Dean before most of them were born. I worked with him, traveled with him, shared stages with him for 10 years. You can arrest me if you want, but I'm not leaving." The commotion at the chapel entrance was beginning to attract attention from other mourners who were arriving for the service. Some recognized Jerry and understood the significance of his presence. Others simply saw an elderly man in obvious distress, being prevented from entering a funeral by security guards. The situation was rapidly becoming the kind of public spectacle that everyone involved wanted to avoid. At this moment, Frank Sinatra arrived at the chapel in a wheelchair, his own declining health evident, but his determination to honor Dean clear in his expression. Frank saw Jerry arguing with the security guards and immediately understood what was happening. Despite their own complicated relationship, Jerry and Frank had never been particularly close. Frank recognized the genuine grief in Jerry's face and made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire situation. Frank wheeled himself over to where Jerry was standing. "Jerry," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that had made him the acknowledged leader of the Rat Pack, "Dean would want you here." The security guards stepped back, recognizing that they were now dealing with someone whose authority in this situation superseded their instructions from the family. Frank Sinatra's endorsement of Jerry's presence carried enormous weight, not just because of his own status in the entertainment industry, but because of his position as Dean's closest surviving friend and the unofficial head of the Rat Pack legacy. Jerry looked at Frank with tears streaming down his face. "Frank, I just need to say goodbye. I should have said it 20 years ago, but I need to say it now." Frank nodded with understanding. "Come on, Jerry. Let's go say goodbye to Dean." Together, Frank Sinatra in his wheelchair and Jerry Lewis walking beside him, they entered the chapel where Dean Martin's funeral service was about to begin. The sight of Jerry's unexpected arrival created a ripple of whispers throughout the assembled mourners, but Frank's presence beside him legitimized Jerry's attendance in a way that no amount of arguing with security could have accomplished. Dean's casket was positioned at the front of the chapel, surrounded by flowers and photographs that chronicled his life from his early days as Dino Crocetti in Steubenville, Ohio, through his partnership with Jerry, his solo career, his membership in the Rat Pack, and his later years as a television personality and Las Vegas performer. Jerry stopped walking when he saw the casket, overwhelmed by the finality of what he was witnessing. For 40 years, Jerry had imagined what it would be like to see Dean again, what they would say to each other, how they might rebuild their friendship. He had fantasized about chance encounters at industry events, mutual friends arranging reconciliations, or simply running into each other and discovering that the anger had faded with time. None of those fantasies had included Dean being dead, beyond the reach of any conversation or apology. Jerry approached the casket slowly, his composure completely shattered by the reality of Dean's death. He placed his hand on the polished wood and began to speak in a voice that was barely audible to anyone except Frank, who had positioned his wheelchair beside Jerry. "Dean," Jerry whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about everything, about the way things ended, about the stupid pride that kept us apart, about all the years we wasted being angry instead of being friends. You were the best partner I ever had. You were the best friend I ever had, and I was too stubborn to tell you that, when it might have mattered." Jerry's grief was raw and unfiltered, the accumulated pain of 4 decades of regret pouring out in words that Dean would never hear. Other mourners in the chapel could see that something extraordinary was happening, but they couldn't hear the specific words that Jerry was saying to his former partner. "I never stopped missing you," Jerry continued. "Every time I performed, every time I made people laugh, I wished you were there to share it with me. We were magic together, Dean. We were better together than either of us ever was alone, and I threw it away because I was too proud to compromise." Frank Sinatra watched Jerry's breakdown with his own emotions barely controlled. Frank had maintained friendships with both men despite their estrangement, and he had often wished that he could find a way to bring them back together. Now he was witnessing Jerry's final attempt at reconciliation with a man who could no longer respond. The funeral service began with Jerry still standing beside Dean's casket, his hand resting on the wood, as if he could somehow communicate his regret through physical contact. The minister conducting the service had been briefed about Jerry's unexpected presence, and rather than asking him to take a seat, allowed him to remain beside the casket throughout the proceedings. Jerry listened to the eulogies delivered by Dean's children and longtime friends, hearing stories about Dean's kindness, his professionalism, his devotion to his family, and his impact on American entertainment. But Jerry's mind was focused on memories that preceded most of the relationships being described. The early days when he and Dean were young, hungry, and determined to succeed together. He remembered their first meeting in 1946, when they were both struggling performers, looking for a breakthrough that would launch their careers. He remembered the immediate chemistry they had discovered, the way their different performance styles had complemented each other perfectly, and the excitement they had felt when they realized they had found something special together. He remembered the sold-out shows, the movies they had made, the television appearances that had made them household names. But most of all, he remembered the friendship that had sustained them through the pressures of fame and the demands of their career, the conversations that lasted until dawn, the practical jokes they had played on each other, the sense of brotherhood that had made them feel invincible. When the formal service concluded, Jerry remained beside Dean's casket as other mourners began filing out of the chapel. Frank Sinatra wheeled his chair closer and spoke quietly to Jerry. "You said what needed to be said, Jerry. Dean heard you." Jerry looked at Frank with gratitude. "Thank you for letting me be here. I know the family didn't want me here, but I couldn't let him go without saying goodbye." Frank's response was characteristic of his understanding of loyalty and friendship. "Jerry, you were part of Dean's life for 10 years. You helped make him who he was. Nobody had the right to keep you away from saying goodbye." As the chapel emptied, Jerry spent a few more minutes alone with Dean's casket. The words he spoke during those final moments were private, but witnesses said that when he finally walked away, his expression had changed from anguish to something that resembled peace. Jerry Lewis never spoke publicly about crashing Dean Martin's funeral, but friends said that the experience had lifted a burden of guilt and regret that he had been carrying for decades. He had finally been able to apologize to Dean, to acknowledge the mistakes that had ended their partnership, and to express the love and respect that he had never been able to communicate during Dean's lifetime. The story of Jerry's uninvited attendance at Dean's funeral became part of the Martin and Lewis legend, a a reminder that some relationships are too profound to be destroyed by professional disagreements or personal pride. It demonstrated that grief can overcome any obstacle, that love can survive decades of silence, and that saying goodbye is sometimes more important than maintaining dignity. More importantly, it showed that the partnership between Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, despite its acrimonious end, had been built on something authentic and lasting that transcended their ability to destroy it through anger or neglect. Jerry's tears at Dean's funeral were proof that some bonds between people are stronger than the forces that try to break them. In the end, Jerry Lewis had gotten what he needed, the chance to say goodbye to the man who had been his partner, his collaborator, and his friend. Dean Martin was beyond hearing Jerry's apology, but Jerry's presence at the funeral served as a public acknowledgement that their relationship had mattered more than their estrangement, and that love, however imperfectly expressed, was stronger than pride.